Welcome to our deep dive into Alice Miller's The Drama of the Gifted Child. This book really flips the script on what we think we know about childhood,
Oh, yeah.
especially when it comes to these kids who seem to have it all, you know?
Right.
We often equate outward success with inner peace,
Yeah.
but Miller, she argues that some of those gifted kids, the ones that seem like they're, they've got everything going for them,
Yeah.
might actually be carrying deep, unaddressed wounds from their childhood.
That's what makes Miller's work so powerful. She's really peeling back the layers of what we consider a happy childhood and showing us how even in seemingly supportive environments,
Mm.
even when it looks like everything's fine,
Right.
there could be this profound disconnect between a child's true feelings and the persona they present to the world,
It's almost like they're
like they're wearing a mask.
Yeah, and she really drives that point home in chapter 1, right?
Absolutely.
She talks about how crucial it is to face those difficult childhood truths, even if it feels like opening up a can of worms.
Right. And it's not about dwelling on the negative or anything like that, but
Mhm.
about acknowledging those formative experiences that have shaped our emotional blueprints.
Yeah, like where we came from.
She uses a really compelling example.
Oh, yeah.
A child who is outwardly joyful and successful, but inwardly struggling with profound loneliness.
It's so sad.
The child learns to adapt, to achieve, to please, but their true self is buried under layers of, conditioning.
It makes you wonder how many of us have been in similar situations where we felt this pressure to excel while our genuine emotions were just swept under the rug.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's something that so many people can relate to.
Yeah, it's almost like we learn to prioritize achievement over authenticity.
And this is where Miller's argument gets really interesting. She suggests that this type of dynamic where a child's true self is consistently overlooked can lead to what she calls emotional neglect.
Oh, okay.
And it's not necessarily about overt abuse or trauma, but rather a subtle, pervasive lack of attunement to the child's emotional needs.
Okay, so let's unpack what that means. What does emotional neglect actually look like?
Yeah, what are some concrete examples?
Yeah, could you give us some examples of that?
Absolutely. Think of a child who is constantly praised for their achievements,
Oh, yeah, the good job, kid.
but rarely validated for their feelings. Maybe their parents are well-intentioned, they're trying their best,
Right.
but they consistently dismiss the child's emotional experiences, telling them to toughen up or look on the bright side.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Buck up, kid.
yeah, exactly. And over time, this can create a deep sense of invalidation, leading the child to believe that their feelings are not important or
Wow.
worthy of attention.
So it's like we're teaching kids to disconnect from their inner world,
Yes,
to focus on external validation instead of cultivating self-awareness.
that's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And the long-term consequences of this disconnect can be significant. Miller argues that unresolved emotional neglect can set the stage for a host of challenges in adulthood, particularly when it comes to relationships
Yeah.
and emotional regulation,
Oh, I can see that.
being able to manage your emotions.
It makes sense. If you've never learned to truly understand and validate your own feelings, it's going to be incredibly difficult to navigate, the complexities of adult relationships.
Exactly. And this brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of Miller's work, the link between grandiosity and depression.
Okay.
In Chapter 2, she makes a compelling case that both of these seemingly opposite states can actually stem from the same underlying issue,
Okay.
a lack of genuine self-worth rooted in those early experiences of emotional neglect.
That connection isn't immediately obvious. How can grandiosity, this inflated sense of self, possibly be related to depression, a state of profound sadness and withdrawal?
It's a fascinating paradox, but when you look at it through the lens of Miller's work,
Mhm.
it starts to make sense. She argues that individuals who develop a grandiose personality style are often compensating for a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy.
Oh, okay.
They seek external validation, achievements, accolades to prop up a fragile sense of self that was never nurtured in childhood.
So it's like they're building a fortress of accomplishments to protect themselves from the vulnerability of their true feelings.
Exactly. And the problem with this strategy is that it's inherently unstable. What happens when those external achievements don't materialize?
Right.
What happens when the accolades fade?
They don't get that pat on the back anymore.
The fortress crumbles, leaving them exposed and vulnerable, which can then lead to a spiral into depression.
It's almost like they're on a constant emotional roller coaster swinging between these extremes of inflated self-importance and then crushing self-doubt.
That's a great way to describe it. And what's particularly insightful about Miller's work is that she helps us understand the why behind these seemingly contradictory behaviors. She traces it back to those early experiences of emotional neglect, showing us how those unmet needs can leave a lasting imprint on our emotional landscape.
That's where it gets really thought-provoking, because it suggests that both grandiosity and depression are, in a sense, coping mechanisms, ways of dealing with the pain of those unmet needs.
Exactly. And by understanding those underlying dynamics, we can start to shift from a place of judgment to a place of compassion.
Oh, that's a good point.
It's not about blaming individuals for their grandiosity or their depression,
Yeah.
but rather about recognizing that these are often expressions of deeper emotional wounds.
I'm sure many of our listeners are starting to see how these concepts resonate with their own experience, either in their own lives or in the lives of people they know.
Yeah.
It's incredibly powerful to have this framework for understanding these complex emotional states.
That's the beauty of Miller's work. It provides a lens for seeing ourselves and others with greater clarity and compassion. And she doesn't stop there. In Chapter 3, she introduces the concept of contempt, which adds another layer of complexity to this whole dynamic.
Yeah,
But before we dive into that, I think it's worth pausing to reflect on what we've discussed so far.
I agree. Let's take a moment to let these ideas sink in before we move on to the next chapter, which, as you mentioned, explores the challenging topic of contempt and its role in perpetuating these cycles of emotional neglect. Welcome back to our deep dive into Alice Miller's The Drama of the Gifted Child. We've been unpacking how childhood experiences, particularly those unmet emotional needs, can create a ripple effect, into adulthood.
And we were just starting to touch upon the concept of contempt, which, as Miller points out, is often woven into these dynamics.
Yeah, and she introduces it in a rather disarming way with that anecdote about the child being humiliated for wanting an ice cream bar. It seems like such a small everyday occurrence,
Yeah.
but she uses it to illustrate a much larger point
Yeah.
about how contempt can seep into parent-child relationships.
It's a brilliant example of how seemingly minor incidents can reveal these deeper patterns.
Yeah.
In this case, the child's simple desire for a treat is met with not just a no, but with humiliation and a dismissal of their feelings. And that, Miller argues, speaks volumes about the underlying emotional climate.
So it's not just about denying the child's request, but about the way in which it's done. The contempt, the lack of respect for the child's experience, that's what's really damaging.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Miller goes on to suggest that this contempt often stems from the parent's own unresolved emotional baggage.
Oh.
They might be unconsciously reenacting patterns from their own childhoods, projecting their own pain and unmet needs onto their children.
It's that cycle of emotional inheritance we talked about earlier.
Right.
But in this case, it's not just about neglecting emotional needs, but actively inflicting emotional pain, even if unintentionally.
Right. And it's crucial to remember that Miller isn't trying to demonize parents or anything like that.
Right.
She acknowledges that they're often operating from their own wounded places, simply repeating what they know. But by shining a light on these dynamics, she's urging us to become more conscious of how we interact with children and to break free from these harmful patterns.
So if we're all carrying around this baggage, this potential for contempt, how do we even begin to break the cycle? Where do we start?
Well, Miller believes that one of the most powerful antidotes to contempt is empathy.
Okay.
And that starts with understanding our own emotional history, acknowledging those wounds from our past, and developing compassion for ourselves.
It's that idea of mourning our unmet needs that we touched upon earlier. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah.
It's a concept that might feel a bit abstract or even uncomfortable for some people.
It's about allowing ourselves to feel the sadness, the anger, the loneliness that we might have suppressed for years. It's about acknowledging the pain of what we didn't receive in childhood, the love, the validation, the understanding that we craved.
So it's not about dwelling in the past or blaming our parents, but about honoring those unfulfilled needs and giving ourselves permission to grieve them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that grieving process can take many forms. It might involve journaling therapy, creative expression, spending time in nature, anything that helps you connect with and process those emotions.
It's about creating a safe space for those younger parts of ourselves to finally feel seen and heard.
Beautifully put. And as we work through that process of mourning, something really interesting starts to happen. We begin to cultivate a deeper sense of empathy, not just for ourselves, but for others as well.
Because we're starting to recognize that everyone, regardless of their outward appearance or behavior, is carrying their own invisible wounds.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this newfound empathy can be incredibly transformative in our relationships.
Yeah.
It allows us to see beyond the surface, to understand that those who inflict contempt are often acting out of their own pain.
It doesn't excuse their behavior, but it does offer a more nuanced perspective.
Right.
It allows us to respond with compassion instead of reacting with defensiveness or more contempt.
Exactly. And Miller even extends this idea to the therapeutic relationship. She talks about how crucial it is for therapists to be aware of their own childhood wounds because a client's behavior might unknowingly trigger those unresolved emotions.
So even in a professional setting where the focus is on helping others, those old patterns can resurface.
Absolutely. And it's by being conscious of those patterns, by acknowledging our own vulnerability, that we can truly create a space of healing and transformation.
It's about breaking free from that vicious cycle, both on an individual level and in our interactions with others.
And that brings us to another key aspect of Miller's work, the role of societal norms in perpetuating these cycles of emotional neglect and contempt. She argues that our culture often prioritizes achievement and conformity over emotional authenticity.
So it's not just about individual families, but about broader societal patterns that contribute to this disconnect between our true selves and the masks we wear.
Precisely. We're often conditioned from a young age to suppress our feelings, to strive for external validation, and to fit into prescribed molds. And this can lead to a profound sense of alienation and a lack of genuine connection.
It makes you wonder, what would our world look like if we valued emotional intelligence as much as we value academic achievement? What if we encourage children to embrace their vulnerability and to express their true selves?
Those are questions that Miller grapples with throughout her work.
Yeah.
She envisions a society where emotional well-being is prioritized, where children's needs are truly seen and met, and where empathy and compassion are the guiding principles. It's a vision that might seem idealistic, but it's one worth striving for.
And it starts with each of us, doesn't it? By doing our own inner work, by cultivating self-awareness and compassion, we're contributing to a larger shift in consciousness.
Exactly. And that brings us to the close of part 2 of our exploration of the drama of the gifted child.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still much more to unpack. In our final part, we'll delve deeper into the practical implications of Miller's work and explore how these insights can empower us to create healthier, more fulfilling lives. Welcome back to our deep dive into the drama of the gifted child. We've been exploring some pretty heavy concepts.
Yeah.
But I think what's really resonating is that Miller isn't just presenting a problem, she's offering a path forward, you know?
Right. It's not just about diagnosing the issue.
Yeah.
It's about okay, what can we do about it?
Exactly. So let's talk about that path forward. What are some tangible steps listeners can take to apply these ideas to their own lives?
Well, as we've been saying, it all starts with awareness. Recognizing those patterns from childhood that might still be playing out.
Right.
Understanding how those early experiences shaped our emotional responses.
So it's about putting on our detective hats and really examining our own behaviors, our reactions and relationships, and asking ourselves, is this really about the present situation or is something deeper being triggered?
Exactly. And that's where things can get tricky because we often become so accustomed to these patterns that we don't even realize they're operating.
Yeah, they're just kind of on autopilot.
Yeah, totally on autopilot.
Right.
But once we start paying attention, once we become aware of those automatic responses,
Right.
we can begin to make conscious choices.
So it's not about erasing the past or blaming our parents, but about taking responsibility for our own emotional well-being in the present.
Precisely. And that can involve a lot of different things. It might mean setting boundaries in relationships,
Yep.
learning to say no when you need to, prioritizing self-care, exploring therapy.
Right.
Even something as simple as journaling to process those emotions.
It's about becoming our own best advocate, our own source of validation and support.
Yes. And that can be incredibly challenging, especially if we've spent a lifetime seeking validation from others. But it's in that process of turning inward, of cultivating self-compassion, that we truly begin to heal those old wounds.
It's about replacing those patterns of contempt and emotional neglect with something much more powerful, self-love and acceptance.
And as we do that, as we break free from those cycles, something truly amazing happens. We start to see those same patterns in others, not with judgment, but with understanding.
Oh, that's a good point. We can relate.
Yeah, we can relate. We can see where they're coming from.
It's like we're developing a new lens for seeing the world, one that's based on empathy and compassion.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective can be incredibly liberating, not just for ourselves, but for our relationships as well. It allows us to connect with others from a place of genuine understanding, to offer support instead of judgment, to create a space for healing and growth.
And I think that brings us back to that thought-provoking question you posed earlier.
Oh, yeah.
If society as a whole embraced this understanding, if we truly acknowledged and addressed childhood emotional neglect,
How might our world be different?
how might our world be different? It's a big question.
It's a huge question. It's a question that invites us to imagine a world where emotional intelligence is valued as much as academic achievement,
Right.
where vulnerability is seen as strength,
Mm.
where empathy is woven into the very fabric of our institutions.
It's a world where perhaps those labels of gifted and wounded wouldn't be so mutually exclusive.
Exactly. Because ultimately what Miller is calling for is a radical shift in our understanding of what it means to be human. It's about recognizing that we all come into this world with innate needs for love, connection, and validation, and that those needs, when unmet, can create ripples that extend far beyond our individual lives.
It's a powerful message and one that I think has resonated deeply with our listeners. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the drama of the gifted child.
It's been a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.
We hope this exploration has sparked some reflection and inspired you to continue your own journey of self-discovery.
Remember, healing is a process, not a destination. And as Miller so eloquently reminds us, the path to wholeness begins with the courage to face our own truths with compassion and understanding.
Until next time, keep diving deep